Hello. With discussion forum 7, we shift our attention from studying deductive logic to studying inductive logic. Now, there are a couple of ways that we can review what it is to reason our way to a conclusion deductively or inductively. When we reason deductively, we are guided by the structure or the form of the argument. An argument that succeeds in establishing its conclusion by way of form alone is called a deductively valid argument or a valid argument. It's also called a logically correct argument. An argument that fails by way of its form alone to establish the conclusion is an invalid argument. Recall two further evaluation concepts, soundness and unsoundness. All invalid arguments are unsound. That's because, by definition, a sound argument is valid. In addition to an argument's validity being a necessary component for or requirement of an argument being sound, it's also the case that the argument's premises are in fact true. So, a sound argument is valid and its premises are in fact true. We have arguments that are valid but unsound, and again, all invalid arguments are unsound, but a sound argument is valid and the premises are true. Inductive reasoning is, on the other hand, not mechanical, right? There's a sense in which a deductive argument's machinery is what does or does not guarantee the conclusion. Whereas when we're talking about inductive reasoning, while it's true that there are patterns we can follow, so this week's discussion will be an example of thinking about a pattern of inductive reasoning. It's not the case that inductive reasoning's conclusions are guaranteed in a mechanical way, right? There's no form of an argument or structure of an argument such that whatever you pour into the premises yields the conclusion when the reasoning is valid. What we have instead with inductive reasoning or experiential or empirical reasoning is reasoning that, while following certain patterns, relies on experience. One way that you might think about inductive reasoning is as follows. You and I have all sorts of beliefs. Some of our beliefs are really intensely held. And one question we can ask is, when we have a really intensely held belief, why is it so intensely held? And one answer to that question when we're thinking in terms of inductive reasoning is, well, there's so much experience, there's a preponderance of the evidence that makes me think it's so unlikely for the conclusion to be false, or it's so unlikely for my belief to be false, that's why I hold on to it, right? So that's one way that you might think about experiential or inductive reasoning. We'll see that just as with deductive reasoning that fails, there are ways that inductive reasoning fails. So we will have a couple of evaluation concepts with which you're already familiar, right? We've got a strong inductive argument, we've got a weak inductive argument, and then we also have corresponding evaluation concepts that parallel the concepts of soundness and unsoundness. So a strong inductive argument whose premises are actually true is cogent, right? You can have a strong inductive argument that's uncogent or is not cogent, and that's because at least one of the premises is false. And then every weak argument is uncogent. Think about this as you're working through your study of inductive reasoning, that it's more the case that the evaluation concepts are on a spectrum of likelihood or of strength and belief or conviction, right? It's not the case that the argument just simply succeeds or fails, as is the case with deductive arguments. So with that in mind, let's go ahead and take a look at this week's discussion forum prompt. Two prompts, actually, so you choose which one you want to address. The first is from philosopher Bertrand Russell. He mounts an analogical argument in support of the view that other minds than my own exist, or other minds in addition to my own exist. And then the second prompt is from philosopher David Hume. And here you're looking at a passage in which Hume is casting doubt on the traditional ways in which we think about cause and effect relations. So both analogical reasoning and causal reasoning are two patterns of inductive reasoning, or experiential or empirical reasoning. They're incredibly important to our daily lives. They're incredibly important to the way that, for example, the sciences proceed. So having a good grasp of what we're doing when we reason analogically, when we reason according to cause and effect, is quite useful to us and will make all of our reasoning more robust. So let's go ahead now and take a look at the two prompts, as well as the instructions for your original contribution and your peer reply. Okay, so for your original contribution, you are going to choose to address the prompt for the Bertrand Russell essay, or the prompt that asks you to read an excerpt from a book by David Hume. So the Bertrand Russell essay is short. It is an analogical argument for the view that it's plausible or reasonable, by way of analogy, to believe in other minds, while the second is a critique of the traditional ways that we have of thinking about our belief in causal relations. So what I'm asking you to do here is simply, it's very similar to your first discussion post, where you extract the essential features of the reasoning, except in the first case, in the case of Russell, I'm asking you to work the standard form argument according to the way that analogical reasoning works, or the pattern of analogical reasoning works. So you'll want to make sure you're familiar with the basic formula or pattern of analogical reasoning. And then for the second, whereas the first is going to, by way of the pattern that you use to reflect the reasoning, you'll show that you're highlighting analogical reasoning. In the second, you're not, by way of the pattern that you use, the standard form presentation of the argument, explicitly showing causal reasoning, but the way that you formulate each of the sentences should show your reader that the argument that you're encapsulating is an argument involving causal reasoning. Okay, so that's the first part. And then the peer reply involves something that you know how to do already, namely choosing a prompt, addressing a classmate's post where that post addresses the prompt that you did not choose. So, for example, if you wrote about Hume's argument, you're going to choose a classmate who focused on Russell, and vice versa. Remember that while it's perfectly fine for you to talk about your appreciation of your classmate's post, and I'm glad that you do that, that's not your focus, right? You want to not simply say that you appreciated the post, but how and why.